Hello everyone, and welcome to this session which will focus on customs and the upcoming changes in that area. I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Anna and I've been working in customs and international trade for over 18 years. I run a company called Trade and Borders, which provides customs skills training and consulting services. I advise UK companies on all things customs. It's been a busy couple of years for UK importers and exporters, particularly for the ones that trade with the EU. And as you all know, the changes on the UK side have been introduced gradually. Border controls, checks, and so on. For many businesses, that meant constant changes and just difficulty in terms of keeping up with what's coming, in terms of delayed deadlines and postponed introduction of checks. But there's still quite a lot to come in the next months and years, both in terms of deadlines as well as just new controls being introduced. So today I will look at some of the things companies should be aware of in terms of customs and when the likely changes are about to take place. Now, I will not cover the Windsor framework just because it's quite a big topic and can be a topic in itself, and the new system around red and green lanes recently entered into force, so I will not be covering that due to the lack of time. Okay, so the first point is the days of flow over revenue are over. So just after Brexit, HMRC has made a decision to prioritize flow over revenue. This was both in terms of postponed customs declarations and special easements that some of you might remember, but also just in terms of how non-compliance was approached, or simply just in terms of volumes of checks and audits and so on. But what we've recently been seeing with clients is that this is now changing. We're seeing more and more post-importation notices and questions from HMRC. And as you might know, HMRC has 3 years after the goods enter the UK to come back and ask for documentation, ask any questions, and check whether everything was done correctly. So the questions that companies are receiving right now vary, but a lot of them are quite basic around classification, origin of products, or the customs value that was declared. If any mistakes are found, taxes are collected, and they can be collected for the previous 3 years. So what does it mean for companies? Well, compliance is becoming increasingly important. Companies need to be aware that they are legally liable for any information that's submitted to HMRC and other authorities when it comes to their imports and exports. So while you may rely on your customs broker, it is important to know what they are submitting on your behalf, and it's important to check whether that information is correct. The second point is around the Border Target Operating Model, or BTOM, as it's also sometimes called. Okay, so the latest and apparently final version of the Border Operating Model was published in August. This is an ongoing introduction of border checks and procedures on the UK side, the way the information is submitted when you import into the UK. It's also related to the government's wider vision and approach to border processes and what the UK government sees as the future of the UK borders. This was all outlined in a document published a while back that was called Border 2025 Strategy, and it talked about streamlining procedures, processes, and also an introduction of the single trade window, which I will mention later on. The changes under BTOM apply to imports from the EU, but they also apply to imports from the rest of the world. The publication of this final version of the target operating model followed a period of stakeholder engagement and consultations and includes quite a lot of feedback from the private sector. Most of the changes include or cover measures around SPS goods, so goods that these are measures in terms of ensuring that imported plant, animals, animal products, food and feed are safe for consumption and pest-free. And this is kind of a continuation of the government's approach to categorize these goods based on the perceived risk in terms of, again, safety and diseases that might be introduced to the UK territory. But these are not the only changes. And it will have, so the border target operating model will have an impact on wider customs control, especially for companies that are importing from the EU, but as I mentioned, not only from the EU. So these are the main changes and the dates in which they will be introduced. I will not go through all of this. Again, most of them affect SPS controlled goods, but a couple of things to point out here. You can see that there are also changes in terms of imports into the UK, actually specifically here, Great Britain, of goods from the Republic of Ireland. So if you are importing from Ireland into Great Britain, some of the simplifications currently available will be gradually removed throughout 2024, and full controls and requirements will be introduced. Another change here that's important to point out is are the changes around safety and security declaration, or actually in the end of a waiver that was available for the EU and some other countries in Europe, for example, Switzerland and Norway. Now, safety and security declarations are a form of pre-notification that is submitted by the carrier. So it's not actually the importer or exporter that needs to submit these declarations, but it's the carrier. However, the carrier gets the information from the importer and exporter, so the companies are involved in that process from that perspective. And here what we're saying is that there will be a reduction of data requirements, so there'll be a reduced data set. So currently this declaration has 37 fields and 37 data points. It will be reduced to 20, and then the other ones will be conditional or optional. So it will be streamlined, and this will also be related to the introduction of the single trade window, which again, I will mention in. There are still some open questions remaining. We know that there will be a new trusted trader scheme introduced for food, animal and plant products, and there will be a pilot going on throughout 2024 for which companies can sign up to be part of that pilot and help to shape that new trusted trader program. There are some other questions that are still awaiting further clarification and further information. For example, how much will the checks for SPS goods cost at the border or at the border control points and posts? This is something that companies that import affected goods obviously would like to know as soon as possible. So what does the BTOM mean for companies? In general, basically it means further changes ahead. Throughout 2024, there will be several deadlines, several things will change. Some of these changes, like the SPS measures, will only affect certain companies, the companies that import these types of goods. But this should also be viewed in terms of this wider context of the Border 2025 strategy and this kind of overhaul or kind of work that the UK government is currently doing to reshape the way UK borders function. And this is, for example, there's ongoing work around how companies apply for customs authorization. There are changes to how data will be submitted. There's a general movement towards kind of digital submission of documents and so on. So this will be an ongoing process that companies will be involved. The next point is IT changes, new IT systems and ongoing changes to the existing systems. So here we've got an ongoing migration from Chief to CDS as the main IT system for submitting import and export declarations. Importers have now mostly moved to CDS, so completed the migration, but for exporters, this migration continues and there are new deadlines to come. I mentioned the single trade window a couple of times, and this will be quite a significant change. So the single trade window is in a way, one-stop shop for all information related to imports and exports of goods for all parties involved. So this will be a kind of a system where all parties can submit information, check information, including authorities. So this is both HMRC and DEFRA and other government departments. It will be introduced in stages, we know that now. So what was initially covered in Border 2025 document will not be delivered in 2025, but an initial version with some basic functionality should be available quite soon, and companies submitting declarations themselves will see some of the changes. Companies using customs brokers will gradually also see that the way that information is submitted and the way the information is exchanged with the government will slowly change. The single trade window basically will simplify and streamline procedures and will also help to prevent duplication of data submitted, which at the moment is quite common. For those of you using transit, there is also going to be some changes to the transit system. The deadline has recently been postponed to 2024. So again, we're seeing that 2024 is going to be a year where a lot of changes take place. So what does it mean for companies? With CDS, one of the things that companies need to be aware of is that even though you might not be submitting customs declarations yourself, it might be your customs broker that does that on your behalf. There's still an impact for companies here. So there are a number of known issues with CDS, number of kind of workarounds, and a list is published by HMRC. With some of these issues with CDS, it's important again for companies to make sure that they communicate with their customs broker and ensure that all the information that's submitted is correct. We've seen instances where, due to some kind of glitches or issues with CDS, companies ended up paying more duties than they needed to because of the way that some of the workarounds work. So again, it's important to kind of be aware of what the information are that you're submitting, work with your customs broker, make sure that the amount of duty you are paying is correct. And of course, if there's any overpayment, you might need to contact your customs broker and reclaim that from HMRC. And with the single trade window, as I mentioned, companies will gradually see a simplification of how data is exchanged with customs authorities and other authorities when it comes to international trade. The next one is new trade agreements. Technically, there's nothing immediate here on the horizon. The UK negotiated and joined CPTPP, which is a large trans-Pacific agreement, and we have bilateral agreements with the majority of the members already in place, but this is a kind of regional larger agreement. This agreement will only enter into force when the UK and all the other parties have finished their legislative processes, which is expected to perhaps be towards the second part of 2024. The UK is also negotiating an agreement with India, and that might be the next one that will be signed. But again, it will be signed, but perhaps it will take a while before it enters into force. There are two newish agreements that recently entered into force. So they have been negotiated and they're now in force. And these are the agreements with Australia and New Zealand. So what does it mean for companies? If you are importing from or exporting to any of the markets that are covered by a trade agreement and you are not using preferential tariffs, it may be worth familiarizing yourself with the conditions for being able to take advantage of these preferential tariffs. So these are the famous rules of origin that allow you to take advantage of those reduced or removed tariffs. And if you are not using these trade agreements now, again, it might be worth looking into this and seeing whether you are perhaps eligible for these discounts, and maybe you can benefit from lower tariffs. The final point I'm going to mention is CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. So CBAM is not a customs measure, and it's also not a UK one. So this is a requirement for EU importers of certain carbon-intensive goods to start reporting on embedded emissions contained within these goods. So this entered into force in October, on the 1st of October 2023, and at the moment it's just requirements for quarterly reports, but eventually it will be a tax, it will be a levy applied at the border. So since this is a EU measure, why does it matter for UK companies? Well, it matters in two ways. on one hand, any UK company that imports into the EU will be affected by these measures, and the threshold for in terms of the value of consignment is very low. It's only 150 euros. So if you're importing something into the EU as a UK company, or you have a branch or a sister company in the EU, if it's above 150 euros per consignment, you may be affected by this requirement. Then the second way in which that impacts UK companies is that if you supply any of the affected goods, so any of the kind of carbon intensive goods listed in CBAM regulation, you might need to provide data on the embedded emissions to your suppliers, so to your clients. So either way, if you are exporting or importing any of these goods or trading between the UK and the EU, if these goods fall within the scope of CBAM, you might be required to start providing information or reporting. The first reports are due on the 1st of January or by the 1st of January of 2024. As I mentioned at the beginning, it's just a report, but then eventually at the end of the transition period, it will actually be a tax, and there are some penalties involved if you don't report the emissions and if you make a mistake. There's, as I mentioned, a strong customs element to this, to CBAM, and this is around, well, the first point is around companies need to understand what it is that they're importing and exporting, and then obviously they need to look at their commodity codes or the way that their products are classified and check that whether they are correct and whether they're in scope of CBAM or not. Now, this all sounds easier than it actually is. It can be quite complicated, but again, any companies trading carbon intensive products with the EU should start looking into this before January 2024, when the first reports are due. So these are very kind of high level, as a very high-level overview of the changes that are coming. As I mentioned, again, 2024 is going to be an important year from a customs perspective in the UK. There are a lot of changes that are coming in place, and the way the borders or the UK border operates will slowly be changing, and throughout 2024, but also obviously going forward 2025 and 2026. But 2024 will be an important year, so there's quite a lot to come, and it would be helpful for companies to, again, have a good relationship with their customs broker if they're using customs broker, or speak to their internal customs teams if they have an internal customs team, and make sure that they are prepared and ready for what's to come. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Anna. Your presentation was so clear, in fact, that I don't actually have many questions that I'd like to ask you. There is one point in particular that I would like to just clarify. So when it comes to, obviously, customs clearance procedures are constantly changing. As you've pointed out, in 2024, I think there are 3 main changes or developments that we can expect to see. When it comes to a UK business, for example, one that might have an in-house team, customs team, obviously the communication there would be key to knowing about these updates and making sure that, you know, the business doesn't incur fines or pay prices that are, you know, higher than they should do. If the business has an external customs broker, which is obviously another alternative, I just want to clarify, whose responsibility is it? Is it the business itself, or is it the customs broker to relay the information back to the business and avoid those fines or those high costs?
Yeah, so this is a very, very important point, and it's one of those things that most companies tend to miss, or kind of, it's not really very clear for companies. So the company, the exporter or importer, is always legally liable for the information that's submitted on their behalf. Now, whether you have an internal customs team or not, that doesn't matter. It's important to kind of point out that the majority of companies in the UK use a customs broker. I think there are different estimates around, it's around 80 something to 90 something % of UK companies use an external customs broker to submit customs declarations. But the role of the customs broker is simply to submit what the company gives them as information. So that's all they're supposed to do. Because a lot of companies rely on a customs broker, and because customs brokers are very often the kind of the first line of defense, as it were, in terms of customs information, and it is their business, very often customs brokers will provide additional support, will provide additional information, and will be the kind of the party that highlights these changes to their clients. But again, it's important to know that if something goes wrong, HMRC will be asking the company for information. So if there's any issues, any questions, any doubts, it's the importer or exporter that will receive this letter from HMRC asking for documentation. So it's always the company that's legally liable, even though very often companies do tend to think that if they have a customs broker, then that's all good and well, but that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, I guess then that a key element here would be trust between the company and the customs broker, because as you just pointed out, businesses would possibly think, well, I've got a customs broker, so they're in charge, and these problems shouldn't happen, but sometimes they can happen. What about, for example, if an importer or an exporter uses its own transportation system, then obviously they would be fully responsible of keeping up with the customs clearance procedures. But in the case that they have a freight forwarder to export their goods, is it then the freight forwarder's responsibility, or does it still remain with the company itself?
So there are a couple of things here. The legal responsibility is always with the company for import and export. The freight forwarder is responsible for the transport of the goods. So they will be, for example, like the carriers I mentioned, is responsible for submitting pre-notifications. They're responsible for their part of communication with ports, obviously, customs authorities, border authorities, and so on. But when it comes to customs declarations, again, it's whether the company is submitting them themselves, so self-declaring, and some companies do that, or they're using a freight forwarder that does that, or a customs agent that does that on their behalf. It's always still companies' responsibility. There are some exceptions to this if the customs broker agrees as a kind of premium service to take some of that responsibility and be kind of jointly liable. There are some exceptions. There are some situations where that's also the case. And again, I think it's important because many companies tend to forget that, and as a result, they tend to overly rely on their customs broker without even being aware of kind of basics of customs. But that's obviously not correct. It is the company. Companies are liable. It is, like any other tax, at the end of the day, it's the same with income tax. At the end of the day, no one's going to come after our accountant. They're going to ask questions. So it works in the same way as any other tax. It's the company that's liable at the end of the day.
I think we'll add into the equation then in addition to the key word of trust, communication.
Yes, and awareness, and kind of it's helpful when companies are just aware of the basic. If you don't have your own customs team, it's good to just kind of understand the basics of customs, understand what commodity codes are. If you want to use trade agreements, understand what rules of origin are, and just have like a general awareness of your responsibilities as an importer or exporter. And then, of course, you can work with a customs broker who's a specialized advisor in this field and can help you. But with this communication and trust, it's important for companies to even know how to ask the basic questions around some of these basic issues. So it's trust, it's communication, and it's also just awareness of some of the main principles.
Well, thank you once again, Anna, for joining us and providing that insight.
Thank you very much for having me.